the trip to Nubia in 2004 might have been the highlight of all of the most fantastic trips that you can imagine anybody has ever experienced. And why was it so significant for me? Because Nubia is an important, forgotten part of our heritage. And in some cases, Dr. Clark or Dr. Ben would say it's part of the stolen legacy of the heritage of Africans of the Nile. So the trip to Nubia, which is in the Sudan, is a combination of a trip to Kemet, which is Egypt. And so in 2004, we had a chance to make the trip between Cairo and Khartoum, which is 1,005 miles. It's over 1,000 miles of extraordinary African glory. From the Great Pyramids of Giza near Cairo in Egypt, or the ancient name Kemet, to the cultures and civilization in the south, which is Nubia. That 1,000 miles, which includes Egypt and the Sudan, Nubia being part of southern Egypt and northern Sudan, is an extraordinary historical connection.
The culmination of the Jeffries Odyssey through Africa, 40-something years. I've always wanted to come to Nubia, never knew why. But now, day after day, tells me why. It's the most extraordinary thing. Nubia is the keystone to African history. It links, because it's where it's situated, it links Kemet, but that's the summit. But it links the heart of Africa, that's the root. It links the highlands of Ethiopia. It's an extraordinary historical legacy of African people. So I'm glad to be here to claim it with our Nubian brothers.
When we speak about Nile Valley civilization, we need to clarify the question of geography, chronology, and epistemology. In other words, how do we know what we know? And so the question of what is Nubia, where is it, and what is the significance is something that we have to clarify.
Nubia today has become synonymous with the word black, but in fact it has its roots from the ancient Egyptian word of Nu, in reference to the gold, where the gold mines were. So it's very important for us to keep that perspective when we use this word, not to use it out of context to refer to a people. More so not, the word Nubia, when it comes to synonymous with black, kind of takes things out of context when we're talking about the Nile Valley. Egyptologists often refer to as anyone of African descent, or dark-skinned people, or brown or black faces, as the Greeks may have called them. They would refer to them as Nubians. Rather, it's the wife of Mentuhotep, Queen T, who was the wife of Amenhotep III. Anyone of any type of dark-complected person, first person they say, this person must have been Nubian. And it kind of plays psychological games with us, because when we think of that aspect and we say that Nubian is black, we're kind of saying that those people are black, and we give a reference or inferring, that the others are not. So we want to kind of tell the world that we understand what Nubian is. Nubian means gold, or Nub is gold, not black.
See, the history is divided up and fragmented. You learn Egypt separately, and then you learn Nubia and the Sudan separately. Then the Sudan in the east is the Anglo Egyptian Sudan, which was dominated by the English during the period of colonization from the 16 and 17, 1800s. Then if you go across Africa, you come to the Western Sudan, and that was dominated by the French. And that's where you have Mali and Chad and Central African Empire and Niger. And so you need to look at this enormous African map in order to appreciate just where Nubia and the Sudan is located and how important it is. But you're talking about the Nile Valley civilization. That would be the most important geographical point to make, that the Nile has its origin in the heart of Africa, in the Great Lakes region of Central Africa, around Uganda, Kenya, Rwanda, Lake Albert, and the so-called Lake Victoria, Lake Nyanza, come together, and they produce the source of the Nile. And then that source begins a 4,000 plus journey up Africa and into the Mediterranean Sea. The Nile is unique. It's the only river that flows that way. Now, the last 1,000 miles of that journey is the greatest civilizing process in the history of the world. In other words, high culture and civilization was reached by Africans in the Egyptian part and in the Sudanese part. And both Egyptian and Sudanese parts include Nubia. So when you look at a map, you'll see a boundary line between Egypt and Sudan. And Nubia will be in this part around Aswan. That'll be the Egyptian Kemetic part. And then when you go over the Egyptian-Sudanese border into the heartland of the Sudan, then you will come into the famous Dongola Reach area, where there's a bend in the Nile. And it's around that bend in the third and fourth cataract that you have the great civilizations of Kush that were referred to the Napatan period. And then a later period closer to the modern era of the Greeks and the Romans would be the Meridic period around the capital Meroe and then also around the capital Napata. But an even earlier period in this whole fantastic area would be Kerma. And when you're speaking of Kerma, you're talking Middle Kingdom, 2000 BC to 1500 BC. That's 500-year period. And so when we say Nubia and the Sudan, you're talking of an unfolding of the history of the Nile Valley, which is extraordinary. And for me to have experienced it in one trip was a dream of a lifetime.
So you have the Amos dynasty, you have the Tutmos dynasty, and then you have the Amenhotep dynasty. Three great African family dynasties of male and female rulers, of great builders for eternity, of those who raised anew the spiritual relationship of the creation to humanity, and raised anew the belief in the moral and ethical core of the Nile, the concept of Ma'at, living by a moral and ethical code to be worthy of the God within, reflecting the God without. And so, to go to Tel Hamana and Saqqara as an introduction to Nubia was enormous.
On trips there, we were able to visit the three great points of history in Nubian civilization, or should I say so-called Nubian civilization. First being Kermi, Napatan, and last the Meroitic civilization. And you have to keep in mind that these areas were given their names from present day or modern day settlements around them. Like for example, Kerma It's very important when you understand the history of Kerma because Kerma has its history probably older than any other form of civilization we have in the Nile Valley. But unfortunately, we don't know what the people of that time referred to themselves as because there was no written script. Kerma gets his name from a modern-day village in close proximity. Napata and Meroe, we're not really quite sure where they get their names from. Because once again, you're dealing with Nubian history. They went through periods of time where history was unrecorded, literally, because there was no script. Up until the point of Egyptian or the Kemetic domination or infusion, if you will, the Nubians did not have a written script. Later on in history, and during the Meroitic period, they adopted their own script, which was, again, taken from the Meta-Nextia. In fact, if you look at the alphabet, you can see that the alphabetic signs or symbols were taken derived from the Meta-Nextia. Today, this language, like early Nubian, or I should say Nubian history, prior to the Kemetic infusion, is undecipherable because we cannot read this script. I guess we have to find what they refer to as a modern-day Rosetta Stone to be able to translate the Meroitic and break the code. When you come into Sudan, first place you enter is Khartoum. Then you make your journey north. So in a sense, we were going back in time, but making our stops at the most current locations first. For example, first place was Meroe. When we went to Meroe, we got a chance to see the ancient cemetery or the necropolis, the pyramid field of Meroe, which to me is probably one of the most beautiful places on earth in terms of ancient architecture and how it contrasts between the sky and the sand. It's beautiful. It's like, it's breathtaking. There's something about Meroe that does something to you when you're there. When we speak in terms of Meroe, you have to talk about the Kindake, or the Candace, commonly referred to as Candace. And it's kind of funny, when we read history, history speaks of these great queens of Meroe, and every queen they refer to as Candace. Like, well, wow, how many Candaces were there? Was the Candace that fought the Romans in 24 BC? Was the Candace that was raiding her troops to fight Alexander when he was, after Alexander conquered the Persian Empire, which Egypt encompassed at that time, which was in 330 BC. So which Candace are we referring to? When we come to find out, when we look at the language, we understand what the word Kindake, which was misinterpreted as Candace, we understand that that's the word in Meroitic for queen. So they were just saying queen, as opposed to the name of an individual. Historically, we look at the kingdom of Meroe. Meroe does not really begin to thrive until about the 4th century BC. Around the 300 and something BC period, up until about 380. So about 600 years, Meroe thrives as a great, great civilization. Before Meroe, again, we had Napata. Napata begins to merge around the turn of maybe the 9th century BC, up until somewhere around the 4th century, when the kingdom began to move south. There's actually accounts or records, if you will, of Meroe and Napata existing simultaneously. It's really unsure of when actually one ended and when the other one began. We know around the time, like I said, the 4th century, the power space, so the influx moved south. But I believe that Napata was always reverenced perhaps as the great, not only because the ancestors were there, but also the great temple of Juan, the holy mountain of Jebel Barku, was there, the temple of Amen. and that was the seat of power. That was the seat of actually what they refer to as the seat of God. So no matter if it was the Merowe at that time, I believe the Merowites would have made their pilgrimages north to Napata, not only to commune with their ancestors, but to be where it actually all began. We also had a chance to visit the royal city, or should I say what the pyramid for the Merowe was the joined royal city. One of the great things about the ancients, their burials weren't that far away from where they actually lived. And usually within the living quarters or the cities or the living places where they actually dwelled was always a great temple, usually to the principal deity at that time or the principal understanding for which they were trying to relate to at that time. And the royal city of Merowe, you see one of the great temples of Amun.
We're standing here at the Roman-style bathhouse in the royal city of Norway.
We also have what they refer to as the Nubian bathhouse. And the Nubian bathhouse is quite interesting because it wasn't until about maybe 40 years ago they actually discovered the true purpose of this. And the reason what happened was that now actually over-flooded and the water began to come out of the mouths of these lines that are around the bathhouse. And they understood that, wow, this was actually a place that they had as a bathhouse.
And the water comes inside through the mouth of all these lion. Yeah. Come back on Malay. Come.
It's actually referred to as a Roman style bathhouse. And one thing you understand during this period, the Nubians, or excuse me, the Merowites, had close relations to the Romans, and they inspired some of the Hellenistic ways of doing things. And that was an example.
It's 1946.
1946
A
was
very
what?
famous flood. He said his father, he came early in the morning just to check. He found this full of water, Then they called the people of the day in Khartoum. They head over to the antiquities. They came, they just make holes outside.
See where
From where the water comes, they just got some of the alabaster. But the water did not come from the regular, circulation of that one. All these holes, they have some, it comes inside. But the main gate, you can say, for water is from that line in the corner. It comes from up to this. There is a hole over there,
Right.
at the end of the back of the line. It comes through that one and comes inside. And down, it goes out by that alabaster tubes.
Now it's funny because at this point, you have to travel almost downstream to go north because the mile makes this sharp S curve. And the quickest route to get to Napata is actually through the desert. And you cut across the desert at the same time. And doing such, it's, I often tell people this when I speak about Nubia. It was really a surreal feeling. And to really actually go across the desert, it was like literally almost going through a time machine. Sometimes thinking about it, I get goosebumps myself. And having made that trip twice, I'm like, wow, almost like I can't believe I was actually there. Every time I look at pictures, I see it, and I'm like, did it actually even take place? That's how surreal it is. It's a place of history and time stood still. It literally stood still. And it's the most amazing thing on earth. I can't describe anything that's better than that. And I love Egypt. But this place, it's almost, like I said, it's enveloped in the fabric of time. But as we went across the desert and we arrived in Napata, the first place you have to visit is, again, the centerpiece for the kingdom itself, and that is the temple.
The part of one of the most important archaeological sites in Sudan, the site is called Jabal al-Barka site. Jabal al-Barka site is the part of the Kushite civilization. The chronologies of this site is dated back to the mid of the 8th century BC. And now we are in front of the Amun Temple. This Amun Temple is built here by the Sudanese, the Nubians, in fact, and the Ammon. You see that it is faces the sun and at the same time the Nile. Yeah, the Nile is nearby. Yeah.
The temple not only was the engine which moved the country or the civilization on its everyday basis, the temple was where the priests were. The priests were your educators, your healers, your teachers, your doctors, your lawyers. The priests were preside over legal issues, marital issues. So everything kind of took place there. Not only that, the granaries, the food supplies were often a lot of times divvied through the temple. So the temple, was not the temple in a sense of a modern day house of worship, but everything pretty much took place there. In addition to learning about the cultural aspects of the God itself or the principle, and we speak about honor, we're talking about the hidden principle of the universe. Christians often say that God works in mysterious ways. Whenever I want to try to explain to someone what the Amen is, I always tell them, think of the Amen as God working in mysterious ways. Things that God does that do that we cannot see. Things that we don't understand. Things that are beyond our comprehension. It's the Amen. Nubians, more times than not, depict the Amen as ram-headed, for as a symbol of fertility. Whereas in Kemet, a lot of times you see the black. The black represents that triple blackness, the unconsciousness before the consciousness. See, the Bible speaks about, in the beginning, God willed itself into existence. Out of the darkness came light. That darkness was the Amen, or referred to as the Amen. That darkness was, in John chapter 1, speaks about, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. That's the Amen. And that was a comprehension of Amen. So the temple of Amen at Baku became the centerpiece for the great civilization of Napata, or the great kingdom state of Napata. When you speak about Napata, you talk about, again, Baku, but also you move now into the great necropolises, the oldest being that of Kuru. It seems like there was a relationship between the people or the civilization to the north of Kuru, which is Kerma, and the Bears Kuru. Like the last person who died at Kerma was succeeded by the first ruler of Kuru. Before the time of Pianki, we're kind of struggling with who actually ruled and how long they ruled because, again, history wasn't written down. Pianki preceded Kasha, and Kasha was after a king by the name of Alara. Before that, we have tombs which we just kind of marked as KU Tumle 1, and so forth and so on until we get to the point of Pianki, where it starts to record the history once again, because now they're using actually the Metanetia. Now they're using Egyptian hieroglyphics to write the history down. This is the Nubia referring to. Speaking about Kuru, Kuru's very important because it gives you an example of what a Nubian grave would have looked like in that period of time. And in Kuru, we have two great tombs you could actually visit. One being that of Queen Kahalta, who I believe was a sister of Pianki. And one you have also that of Tutankhamun, who was a nephew of the great King Taharqa. And when you walk into their tombs, you get a sense of awe because the art is beautiful. One of the things we see in Queen Kahalta's tomb is a great Nubian funerary bag. I know they say in Ghana, sometimes people lay the rest on beds as well to this present day. So you see the influx of civilization moving across the continent. You also see the opening of the Mount ceremony, which we know was very prominent in Kemet, which was a part of the evolution to the next life, giving sight and sound and ears, being able to speak. And the afterlife was a very important part of our ceremony and ritual and our transition. You also have the tomb of Tutankhamun. When you look at his tomb, you see one of the most important things when I try to talk about Nubian kingship and how and it actually gives reference to Jebel Baku on his crown. The Nubians wore a crown shaped like the mountain, with the uraei or the flaming cobra coming up from the brow of the crown. That was a symbol of Jebel Baku being the seat of the power of the kings of Nubia. Next, we move across the river to Nuri, which comes after Kuru in terms of burial. One thing to understand is that Nuri and Kuru, for a short period of time, went back and forth. What I mean by that is, we had a king who died. He decided to be buried in Nuri. His preceding king will say, you know what, let me go back to Kuru. And it's went back and forth about 4 generations, up until around the 5th century BC, where most of the kings and queens decided to lay rest at Nuri. There are more pyramids in the pyramid field in Nuri than it is at the pyramid fields of Giza, Abu Qusayr, Saqqara, and Dashur combined. There's over 74 pyramids constructed at Nuri, 54 for queens and 20 for kings. And again, things in terms of the mass volume, or just how beautiful that would have looked in ancient times, I'll give you an example of what Napata would look like in its glory ages.
At this site, you have a trinity of African history, ancient history. You have Nuri, where Taharqa has his pyramid along with many others. And then you are here on the other side of the river at El Kuru, where the great Yankee has his tomb and others. And then you have the great holy mound, Jebel Baku. And so you have in this site a trinity of sacred spaces.
You have several types of monuments in Egypt and the Sudan. Both of them developed a tradition of having a certain set of monuments on one side of the Nile and another set of monuments on the other side. For example, one side of the Nile in the east was considered the land of the living. And so the great temples and other buildings would be located on that side. Then the western part of the Nile was the land of the transition. And that included the mortuary temples and the actual burial sites. And so you have a combination based upon the geography of different types of structures. The pyramids in the Sudan were built 2,000 or so years after the pyramids in Giza, and they're of a different nature. The great pyramids of Giza that were built by the great family of the Old Kingdom, Khufu, Khafra, and Menkaure, the father, the grandfather, and the son. Those pyramids are the greatest building in the history of the world. They're monumental. And they had the stone, the granite stone, that they could quarry in that part of the Nile Valley. And they could bring it easily from other parts of the Nile Valley. So they had these millions of blocks, of enormous blocks, that they were actually able to put in place in the greatest building in the history of the world. The pyramids in Nubia are of a different nature. They are a reflection of pyramid building, but they have their own particular form. They don't have the chambers, the burial chambers in the structure. They have the burial chambers under the structure. And they have a mortuary chapel that you go into as you enter into the going under the pyramid structure to the actual burial. And so you would have the dimension of inner climbing up into the belly of the pyramid, such as the Great Pyramid, because they're not that of that size. However, this one great pharaoh, Taharqa, whose cover is gracing the National Geographic, when his father and his uncle, and he followed them, and they were able to unify the cultures of the Nile in Egypt and the Sudan, um, and able to give a rebirth to the building and to the high level of the culture. uh, Taharqa had started his burial pyramid in Nubia, but after the conquest of the Nile by this family dynasty, um, Taharqa had his a new pyramid built over the old pyramid, in which he doubled the size. And so the largest pyramid of the pyramid fields in Nubia, there's several of them. There's more pyramids in Nubia than in Egypt itself, but they're of a smaller size. But Taharqa was so inspired by the great pyramids of Giza that when he went home, he doubled the size of his pyramid. So there's actually one small pyramid and another larger pyramid built over it. The same inspiration of the great pyramid building that occurred in Nubia in the kingdom of Kush, and this is this book, The Kingdom of Kush, which deals with the Napatan period and the Meroitic period. This inspiration to build the pyramids also went along with the inspiration to expand the temples. And so some of the greatest building in Nubia are the great spiritual centers that were built particularly to the composite Egyptian god Amun, and often they combine this hidden sense of God with Re. So you have Amun Re. Amun being the hidden aspect of God, Re being the greatest manifestation of God, which is the sun. And so when the Nubians from the 25th dynasty came up from Nubia and reunited the whole Nile, they also rebuilt the temples and expanded the temples, refurbished the temples.
As we move further north from the pocket, going further back in time, we go to Kerma. Kerma finds its roots in about 2500 BC, and we're really not even sure about that, because we understand that there are levels of civilization under the present-day settlement of which we have of Kerma. Kerma came to an end during the 18th dynasty when the Egyptians, or the Kemetu, went south and destroyed the city. People say, well, why does that happen? This is often the part that Egyptologists use to try to say that the Kemetu and the Nubians, or the Egyptians and the Nubians, were hostile to one another and make them like they hated one another. It's a very important piece of history that has to be stated. Kerma rose to power during a period of time where the Egyptian state began to fall during the Second Intermediate Period. And at this point in period of time, they actually had infusions or incursions north into Egypt. Now you had the Hyksos, who come to Egypt during the Second Intermediate Period. They occupied northern Egypt in the Delta. They established a palatial fortress in a place they called Avaris. Avaris is actually one of the tributary branches of the Nile. There they established their stranglehold on the Nile Valley. They didn't control all of Egypt, but they controlled northern Egypt, or lower Egypt. The people in upper Egypt were made to pay taxes to a king called Apepe, who was a king of the Hyksos. Apepe, at a certain point, began to see his stranglehold on the Nile loosening. He didn't have the grip over the people anymore. You had a family of rulers in Waset or Luxor who began to revolt. A great one by the name of Second Rata, who we say he led the first open attack against the Hyksos. And you go to the Cairo Museum, you actually, first moment you see him, you walk in the door. You can actually see the battle scars of Second Rata because he died in battle. His two sons succeeded him, and eventually they were able to overthrow the Hyksos and push them out of Egypt. First being Kamosa, who also died in the battlefield, and finally Amosa. But before that took place, before they were able to expel the Hyksos, King of Pepi found his stranglehold loosening on the people of Upper Egypt. So the first thing he wanted to do was forge an alliance with the Nubians to the south. And from there, they were going to attack each from the north and the south. But on their journey, on his messengers' journey south to Kerma, the Egyptians caught him in the desert. And they found a plan. Now, as this was taking place, the Nubians already had incursions north. They were already raiding north. Not as an organized military attack, but they were raids north into Egyptian cities, as far as what they refer to as present-day El-Kab and Mecca. There's an account of a man by the name of Sabak, who was the governor of Mecca at that time. And on his tomb wall, he explains of the fight they had against the Confederated Nubian state from the south.
Kerma, where they have this unusual brick structure. They call it the Dafufa. There's the eastern Dafufa and the western Dafufa. The western Dafufa is the living, ruling area. The eastern Dafufa is the burial process, where they had the royal cemetery. And it was in this area that they found these 7 pharaohs that had been cut up, and now they're coming up to the world and saying, we're back, in effect. But the thing is that what we don't realize is that this was not where these statues were. They were not in Kerma. The holy parts of the Nile for these brothers was the kingdom of Cush. You see, that's why we've got to start doing more studying, because Kerma and Cush are 2 different historical periods of Nubia.
Kerma, or the eastern Dafufa, the eastern part of Kerma, where the burials are, one of the things we saw there was many different grave goods of Egyptian artifacts. We saw a winged sun disk, or the Haru Beget, that you would typically see entering the temples of ancient Kemet. Now, when we look at the winged sun disk, we understand what it represents. Being placed over the temple walls, it represents the battle of good over evil, of Heru fighting Set and emerging victorious. This is very interesting because this is something that you should not see in Kerma, particularly the eastern Dufufa, or the cemetery field, during this time, which would be about 2500 BC. The Kemetiu, or the Egyptians, did not come this far south until about 1,000 years after that, which would be in the 18th dynasty, about 1550 BC. So this puzzle archaeologists for years, why are we finding statues of Egyptian kings, iconography, everything that would you say prototypically Egyptian in these Kerman graves? Well, come to find out that as the Hyksos were in the north, the people from the Nubians in the south are actually making their raids north into Egypt and bringing back with them booty. They buried it with them. So of course this would have sensed the Egyptians. Or this would have sensed to the point where they knew once the stranglehold from the Hyksos was relinquished, the first thing they had to do was establish themselves south. So as the Hyksos was expelled, they made their strike into Canaan. Present-day Israel became theirs. The next thing they did was they turned south, and they fought the Nubians for 30 years. 3 kings, Amosah, Amenhotep I, and then finally Thutmose I was able to finally destroy Kerma and bring it to its knees and bring it part into the empire. At this point, Jebel Barka was now established as a centerpiece, as the southern frontier of Egyptian civilization. They established Jebel Barka and they named it Kenet Hafa. They established the Temple of Amen. People say they built the temple there because it reminded them of something that was Egyptian, in the sense that in the story of creation we have Ptah rising from Nun, the waters of Nun. the mountain of creation rose. Thus we get the pyramid concept. The pyramid concept comes from the primary waters of Nubia rising and creation being brought forth. Again, we go back into the metaphor, out of darkness comes light. So all these things are connected to them. They see this mountain here as it rises from the natural topography of the land and say, wow, this actually reminded them of the story of creation that they had. So there at the foothills of the mountain, they established this great temple of Amun, which not only set the stage for them sharing their belief system with their brothers, but also set the stage for the 25th dynasty, which was able to establish Ma'at, which was able to establish order in the Nile Valley once Egypt went into its third intermediate period. So it's mighty funny because we always talk about the South, but it seems like no matter what, to reestablish Ma'at or reunify the country, the power always came from the South. It always came from the South. And by them doing that in the 18th dynasty, they set the stage for the 25th dynasty. Because it was the pharaohs Pianki, Taharka, Shabaka, Tanadam, those who fought the Libyan contention in the north. So they weren't fighting Egyptians. People who, they actually liberated their people. They were fighting Libyans. They were fighting Syrians. They were fighting Asiatics, people who actually started to come into the Nile and begin to influence the Nile in a way that was contrary to what their belief system was. So the important thing was that people who knew the truth, who understand who the true people were, who indigenous people were, had to establish that. So Karma, we look at it as a point in history that pretty much changed the world. That pretty much changed things. Karma was burned down, and it's only say fortunately it was burned in a way that was able to preserve much of the settlements there, so we can see what ancient the city-state of Karma looked like. Karma, like many other cities, are ancient archaeological settlements. It gets its name from a modern-day village. We don't know what the name of the place really were. The ancient Egyptians referred to it as Yam. We believe Yam and Karma may have been one and the same. They also sometimes refer to it as Kush. The term Kush begins to come around before the second intermediate period. Between the time of the Middle Kingdom, they begin to refer to the land south of them as Kush. Upper Nubia was referred to as Kush. Lower Nubia sometimes still have referred to as what, or Jute, or Setjut. So these names are very important because these are the names that the ancients referred to them as. Not people they refer to themselves as, but what the least you refer to them as. And the reasons why. Once we understand the names, we could decipher some of the history because the names are very important. We understand that they were different people. Some of the people in the Middle Nile region they migrated from the west into the Nile Valley. And one of the things that we have to understand about the Nile and the ethnicity of the Nile and the different cultural differences of the Nile, particularly in ancient times, is that kind of sets the stage for the pantheon of deities. And it's amazing because it appears that the people who migrated into the Nile Valley came there because they encroached in the desert from the Sahara. And they wanted to go to the oasis, the Nile. The Nile was water, where the life was. And with them, each person brought with them a different way of thinking. And his way of thinking pretty much came from his surroundings, his or her environment. Whether it's from the savannah, whether it's from the jungles, whether it was from the desert, or what have you, they brought with them a different concept, a different belief system. The beautiful thing about the Nile, and that's what I love about ancient Egypt, is that they were able to bring it all together and fuse it into one beautiful pantheon of deities.
One of the greatest stories in the history of the world is the rebirth of Nile Valley civilization in the 25th dynasty. Now, they like to refer to them as the Black Pharaohs, but most of the pharaohs throughout the history of Egypt and the Sudan were black. But they like to pinpoint the 25th dynasty as the Black dynasty. But I think a lot of that has to do with, from the European perspective, and the inability to really see the full blackness of the Nile. But from the African perspective, this was just another great episode in a glorious period of history spanning 5,000 years. And this was just another rebirth in that period. And when you look at the sweep of the 5,000 years, you'll see these great periods of African development. Before we can focus on the question of who ruled. You have to get the migration into the valley of all these different groups. And in other words, groups coming in from the desert areas. The Sahara used to be fertile. 10 or 12,000 years ago, the Sahara began to dry up, and then the groups started moving to water, and so that would have been the Nile Valley. Then you had groups continuously coming up from the south that would come into this fertile paradise. This is really, if you want to talk about Garden of Eden, this is it, running 4,000 miles, with a special section of it, the last 1,000 miles, and that's where you had the birth of Egypt and Nubia. But you have to see these various African communities coming into this Garden of Eden, stretching over several thousand miles, and then becoming more sophisticated and beginning to relate to each other in community. Before you had great kingdoms and empires, and before you were building pyramids and temples, you had thousands of years of people just coming together, living in community. And as the communities expanded and became more complex, then you needed a governmental structure to control this fantastic agricultural development that was taking place.
You can almost chart the history of the Nile by the deities in which you believed in at that time. Each time period represented a different school of thought. Each deity is actually a school of thought. So when we speak about one of the first, we go about the Old Kingdom, or even before the Old Kingdom, and the pre-dynastic Kemet, Heru was, or Horus, was the primary deity. All the kings of the soup, as we refer to them, had the name Heru or Horus before their name. And they were referred to as the Shimshu Heru, which is the followers of Horus. It wasn't until later on that actually Ra emerged, let's say around the 4th dynasty, and Ra became the chief deity, or the primary deity. So each of these phases represents another point in history. So when we look at the iconography, like say for example, the coastal instant burner, and when we talk about coastal, that's a place in southern Egypt, referred to as Lower Nubia, where archaeologists were able to find an instant burner, which had the oldest form of kingship in the Nile Valley. On this image here, on the instant burner itself, you see the king wearing what we refer to as the headjet, or the white crown. Behind him is the hawk, representing Heru, and you also have something, very commonly known as the palace facade in there. You also see something very similar to that in a king of Kush around 1650 BC named Neja. And you see him have the same iconography, the headjet, but in his hand he's holding the mace. Now, the mace is very important because the mace was also a sign for kingship in the Nile. And the rulers of ancient Kemet, they all had maces in their hand. Pretty much that was a symbol for smiting someone. That was basically their form of, weapon. So, you see that once again, how the two kingdoms were really one. And something occurred at some point to actually begin to separate them. They're really one kingdom at one time, especially in the middle Nile region, as they call it, Lower Nubia, Upper Nubia area. That's that bridge right there. That's that gap. And unfortunately, most of the things that were there are destroyed now because of Lake Nasser, almost intentionally, if you will, not to be able to bridge that gap. Because once you establish Nubia and Kemet as one continuous civilization, they're not able to take Egypt out of Africa.
And if you want to go deep into history, that whole area, the scientific finds have established Central Africa and East Africa as the birthplace of humankind, going back millions of years. And then as humankind evolved into large-brain humanity, 150,000, 250,000 years ago, that valley becomes the umbilical cord of the human family. And so the traces of human movement along that river go back many tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years. Now, the period that we're referring to and represents the last 10,000 years, where Africans came and concentrated their communities in this very fertile soil. And the interesting thing is, it's only fertile for a few miles on either side of the banks of the river. 95% of Egypt is desert. And a good part of the part of Egypt that we call Nubia is desert. But the fertile parts are so fertile that you can get 2 or 3 crops a year because of the not only the water, but the richness of the water. Because the nutrients from the soil of inner Africa, coming from Uganda and Kenya, and then the Sudan, and then coming from the highlands of Ethiopia. So you have the Blue Nile, which meets the White Nile, and that's at Khartoum. And then further down the Nile, you get from the highlands of Ethiopia the Atbara River, which brings the rich soil, muddy water into the Nile. It was up until a few years ago when they built the Aswan High Dam, they interrupt the natural process that had been going on for as long as you can imagine. The process has been interrupted because they wanted to use the power of the river to create electrical sources so that they could go into industrialization.
With the Hamdam Dam, there will be some flooding. People will actually be dispersed from their homes. But in terms of a mass flooding of archaeology of monuments, that should not take place. So from that standpoint, it's fortunate we don't have things destroyed overnight. I think over a period of time, things will be affected by the dam. In fact, one of the things about Nubian artifacts or the monuments, Nubians, as most people, they built with materials, raw materials that were around them. And one of the things you see in a lot of Nubian pyramids was the use of sandstone. Sandstone is almost like dust. It's not as strong as limestone or granite for that matter. When the ancient Egyptians built the pyramids, especially the old pyramids in the 4th dynasty, the Giza, the pyramids they were built to stand the test of time. The material used in them was built to withstand elements, rain, snow, wind, whatever. They were built that way. They were built to stand indefinite. Whereas the Nubian pyramids, I believe they had the same concept, but the materials to build in that manner were not available to them. As a result, if you look at them, especially the pyramids built at Nuri, where the wind factor is so high, they're in a great state of disrepair. And that's the reason why the ecosystem is so important there, whereas any place else. If you go to Egypt, one of the fascinating things we tell people all the time over there is look around you. One of the things you never see is a dwelling place for the kings or any ancient houses, because these things were not important to them. So they built with mud brick. Because what was the purpose of trying to build something that was not eternal, to last forever? The things that were important were the Necha, which is the house of the gods, the pyramids, which was a part of the God concept, and the tombs, which was the time capsule. All these things were built to stand indefinite. So the materials employed to construct these monuments were materials that they knew would stand the test of time, because it would tell a story. So the important things, or the things that were involved with God, were built to last forever. Whereas the things where maybe Ramses lived and the richest person probably ever walked this earth, I moved up to third, he had more gold than anyone that we know of. These people, you cannot find one example of how they lived in their houses, because those things were totally wiped away. And they knew that. They didn't care. Dr. Kabashi Gisema, he is the professor of archaeology at the University of Korea, the College of Antiquities or Archaeology, as they call it. He actually showed us the storehouse where they're actually housing or holding the artifacts that are being dug from the salvage from the impending flood built from this new dam.
the comedy palace. Yes. This has been the palace, the comedy palace. Yeah, this year I'm doing. It was been found in front of the palace. Very nice. They are the neighbors. Yeah, they put them here.
Dr. Gabashi.
To establish Nubia, or speak about Nubia, will contradict everything they have said in terms of Africans not having history. Egypt, somehow, they were able to remove from our history that we are now bringing back into our way again. Nubia, they cannot do that with. So instead of, the way they kill it or destroy it, it's not your life not to speak about it. You say Nubia means black? No, Nubia means gold. Kemet means black. Kemet is the black. Right? There are 4 signs or pictorial symbols which make up the word Kemet. One is a charred piece of wood, which is the K sound. One is the M, which is the owl. The other one is a mound, which is the T sound. K and T, Kemet. But the 4th symbol is what they refer to as determinative. This determinative looks like a crossroads almost. And the Kemetu, or the ancient Egyptians, would put this to make it how we say it is what it is. For example, Kemet could be the name of a person. So to separate the person from the place, they put the crossroads there, or the determinative, to say this is what it is. And then we make determinatives in the language. But when they speak about the terms of their land, where they lived, Kemet, with the crossroads, and they understand this is a civilizing process. Egyptologists like to define Kemet as being the black land. They say often that Kemet means the black land. There is the word black in there, but there's no reference to land in there. The ancient Egyptian word for land is ta. They give you a classic example for that. They often refer to their country as Ta-Meri. Mer is love. Ta-Meri means the beloved land. Or they refer to land in the south to them as Ta-Necha, land of the god. or Ta Seti, land of the bow. So the reference on land is Ta. There's no Ta in Kemet. Kemet is the black civilization, the civilization of the blacks. On a rough translation, civilization of the black land, land of the black people, but not the black land. So that's one example. The other word for there's a term for actually king. The word pharaoh, we know, something that was adopted during the later period. It's actually a Syrian word. It was later adapted into the Egyptian language using two symbols: par, which is house, and a, which is great. So when they referred to the pharaoh, it was the great house. The Asiatics referred to the ruler as the great house. That was not what the ancients referred to their ruler as. The word in the Metanetia for ruler is Nusut Beti, which means ruler from actually the south. That's what it means. It means actually the ruler from the south who's a ruler of both upper and lower Kemet. So it has actually two symbols in there. One symbol which is the Su plant, which actually comes before the Beti, which is the bee, and it means ruler from the south. And also, like, you have references to, like, for example, it's funny, but their orientation was different than ours. They had a southern orientation, and the way we understand that is because the word for right is the same word for west. The word right, Yabet, is the same word for Yabeti, west. So their southern they had an orientation to the south, because that's where they understood their origins to be from. This game of color was something that came later on. And even actually go back to Napata, one of the things I like about the tombs in Napata is that the ancient Nubians depict themselves in red. And one of the greatest arguments any Egypt houses will give you is the images on the tomb walls to try to argue their point of people not being black. They say, well, look at the walls. They depict themselves as yellow, red, or what have you. We understand that that was not an actual depiction of pigmentation, but it's something else. The Nubians did the same thing, who are unmistakably black, depict themselves with red paint or dark red paint. Does that mean they weren't black? No, it does not. So we have to get that argument out of our minds. We know that in 1974, in the Cairo Symposium, check out the Diop did the melanin dosage test, which is not surprised the mummies, or the melanin dosage, or the melanin counts within the mummies came back. You know, the levels were, the pigment indicated the pigment was overwhelmingly black. In fact, it's funny, but this is how the Nile looks to them. This is what the lower Nile looks like. Here's an example of an article National Geographic put out in June 2005, which is actually referred to as a new face of King Tut. This is what they would, in their minds, the Egyptian pharaoh look like. Here's an article put out this February 2008 with the Upper Nile Valley or Nubia, and for them there was this drastic difference in a vast difference, excuse me, if you will, of pigmentation of only maybe neighboring people. One looks like this, the other one looks like that during the same period of time.
In the Darfur area, there are 3 or 4 rebel groups that are rising up, and so the central government wants to suppress them. In the meantime, who are the people who are devastated? The women and the children. And so you see the genocide occurring and all of that. And there's a nasty history underlying the relationship between Egypt and the Sudan, that the Egyptians considered themselves superior. And then they've imposed, I don't know whether they imposed, but what emerged was an Arabized leadership in the Sudan that's more Muslim than the Muslims in Saudi Arabia, and certainly the Muslims in Egypt. And so that group has maintained power. And I was trying to say, and I didn't want to say it for the tape, is I have great fear that that group would not care about these monuments to a great extent. So it's better for the Europeans to discover them now, because they're obligated to film and to record. And if they want to get patted on their ass, they got to prepare documentation and present it to the world. Now, they may be able to steal a few pieces in here and there, but the bulk of what they discovered has to be handed to the scientific world. Now, if you read the histories that I've been reading, particularly over the last several months, every night I read another piece and I say, go on a bit. The extent of the theft of what was in the Nile is incalculable. If you realize that a boy king who just made it to 15 or whatever had that type of wealth in his tomb, you can't begin to imagine what all of the others for several hundred years had in theirs. And that wealth has all been ripped off, and it's around the world. And then when you see that the Turks, the Pasha, who was Muhammad, or whatever he was, ruling, Muhammad Ali ruling Egypt, the rich, the Austrian monarchy would say, well, we need some Egyptian stuff, because it became the mode after Napoleon's expedition in 1798-99, and then Napoleon discovered the Nile, and they brought back images of all of these things, and they brought back objects, and so every royalty in Europe wanted to have some of this in order to give them prestige, and so wholesale stuff was just taken out of Egypt and deposited in national treasuries and in private royalty. So you can. This is the greatest distribution of wealth. The Chinese wealth, the native Indian subcontinent, their wealth is not. The Greeks, no. This is the systematic taking and giving. And the grave robbing started back in ancient times, but it has continued on through times. And even those people who discovered King Tut's tomb, and the people were there watching them, and they watched them for years, but they still managed to make sure they got some of that stuff in private hands. But can you imagine spending 4 years taking the stuff out of the tomb? And in fact, in Taharka's tomb, it was completely wiped out, meaning they got everything out of it. But in spite of that, they found 1,000 Shawaptis that are images of Taharka that represent the people who would serve him in the afterlife. 1,000 of them were left. They found gold rings and stuff that was left. In other words, they had so much big stuff they still couldn't leave. But for us, for me, it's the spiritual component, not just the material component. The African civilization, I use the pyramid formula, and I put an inner circle and then an outer circle, and then a yin and a yang. And one side of the yin and the yang I have spiritual, the other side material. What distinguishes African culture from me, for the European cultures, for African culture, is heavily spiritual, heavily material. But it's the spiritual that dominates the material. Whereas they built great pyramids, but these were spiritual centers. They put great material wealth in them, but it was for spiritual purpose. For the European, it's the opposite. He has a spiritual component, a material component, but the material dominates the spiritual. See? It's another way of looking at the world. So the African worldview is important because you have to deal with. Wade Nobles came up with this triad of knowledge, trilogy. Epistemology, how do you know what you know? Chronology, what's the timeline that you have in dealing with the knowledge? And axiology, what are the values that come out of this knowledge flow. And unfortunately for us, what we know comes from the European. And the chronology we have is the European chronology. And then the values that we have, we look at things through his eyes. So we don't even want to look at these things through the, people say, the Ujit, which is the all-seeing eye. Oh, Dr. Jeffries, cover that up. That's the evil eye. And for the ancient Africans, it was God's eye. It was the God eye power given to Heru for his fighting against evil. You know, so it's how you look at it.